It all started with a single leaked video, an unsteady black and white surveillance clip that would spark an international media firestorm, ruin reputations, divide a family forever, and ultimately lead to a courtroom showdown the world never saw coming. A few seconds of footage. No sound. Just grainy, time-stamped frames of a late-night visit to a dimly lit bedroom deep within a celebrity compound. And the unmistakable sight of someone, Kelly Osbourne, wearing gloves. Moments later, those gloves appeared blood-stained. Her figure hunched in front of the doorway. A subtle gesture. A vanishing shadow. And the one question no one could shake. What exactly had Kelly done? To the casual viewer, it might have looked like just another obscure clip circulating on a gossip page. But for those who knew the Osbourne legacy, who had followed the rise and slow unraveling of rock legend Ozzy Osbourne and his larger-than-life family, this wasn't just tabloid bait. It was a red flag, a scream through the fog of fame, signaling that something had gone terribly, irrevocably wrong. And then came the bombshell headline, Kelly Osbourne sentenced. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The world had barely begun to process what the footage suggested before the hammer dropped. The daughter of the Prince of Darkness, once known for her fiery wit, pink hair, and punk rebellion, now stood at the center of an investigation that would captivate millions and split public opinion down the middle. Was she a villain, responsible for unspeakable harm? Or a broken caregiver, overwhelmed by the weight of watching a loved one slowly fade? The truth, as we would come to learn, was far murkier than anyone expected. In the coming minutes, you'll be taken deep inside the Osbourne family compound. We'll explore the life of Ozzy, the rock icon, the father, the fragile man behind the legend, and how a decades-long buildup of fame, dysfunction, and quiet suffering eventually exploded in the most unimaginable way. We'll reconstruct the events surrounding the night of the incident, the surveillance leak, the bloodstained gloves, and the chaos that followed. Through first-hand testimony, forensic experts, family history, and court proceedings, we'll unravel what really happened and why this story goes far beyond scandal. But first, let's rewind. The Osbournes were never a typical family. Even before reality TV beamed their domestic chaos into millions of living rooms, Ozzy's name was synonymous with rebellion. A Black Sabbath pioneer turned solo sensation, Ozzy was never meant to be ordinary. Neither was his family. When MTV aired the Osbournes in the early 2000s, the world was mesmerized. We saw tantrums and laughter, profanity and parenting, dysfunction and love, all under one roof. Kelly and Jack became overnight stars. Sharon, the unrelenting manager and matriarch, controlled the narrative. And Ozzy? He was the stumbling, mumbling, lovable chaos engine at the heart of it all. But fame is never free. Behind the scripted scenes and edited punchlines was something far more complex. A father battling decades of substance abuse, a mother managing crises with brutal intensity, and children struggling to navigate a world where their every mistake was headline material. Kelly, in particular, bore the brunt of fame. Idolized and scrutinized in equal measure, her life was a roller coaster of rehab stints, failed relationships, career shifts, and desperate reinventions. In many ways, Kelly was always trying to prove she was more than Ozzy's daughter, which is what made her fall from grace all the more shocking. As Ozzy's health declined over the years, first with Parkinson's, then back and neck injuries, and a parade of surgeries and complications, it was Kelly who appeared to step up. Photos of her accompanying him to hospitals, public statements defending his privacy, social media posts filled with love, defiance, and worry. For all intents and purposes, she became the caretaker, the shield, the daughter who stayed while others kept their distance. But something changed. According to those closest to the family, the pressure of caring for Ozzy took a toll on Kelly. Her temper flared more often. She withdrew from the spotlight. She canceled events. She stopped updating her followers. Some said she looked exhausted. Others said she looked broken. And somewhere in that silence, something unspeakable unfolded. The CCTV footage that surfaced months later didn't arrive via official sources. It wasn't part of a press release or legal document. It first appeared on a fringe celebrity gossip forum, posted anonymously, with no context. A single file labeled, Osbourne Compound, North Wing Footage 3am. What followed was a media frenzy unlike any other. In the clip, timestamped 3:04 a.m., Kelly is seen walking down a hallway within the family's Beverly Hills estate. She's wearing sweatpants, a hoodie, and what appear to be blue medical gloves. She pauses outside Ozzy's door, looks around briefly, then enters. The door remains ajar. Moments later, she emerges, removes the gloves, and drops them into a small black bag. The most disturbing detail? When the footage is digitally enhanced, several frames show a dark reddish stain on the fingertips of the gloves. The hallway light reflects slightly on the surface, indicating a wet texture, what many now believe was blood. Within hours, the clip had been viewed millions of times. Theories flooded social media. Was Kelly involved in foul play? Was she cleaning up after an accident? Was Ozzy already gone? Or was this some kind of tragic misunderstanding? The Osbourne family initially remained silent. Sharon declined to comment. Jack posted a cryptic story on Instagram, a single quote. "Not everything deserves your attention." Kelly's social media accounts went dark. No denials, no explanations, just silence. And then the investigation began. Los Angeles County authorities confirmed they were looking into disturbing video material linked to an unnamed family compound in Beverly Hills. They wouldn't confirm identities. They wouldn't release statements. But behind the scenes, subpoenas were issued. Former staff were questioned. Security companies were investigated. And slowly, pieces of the puzzle began to surface. Inside sources claimed there were tensions between Kelly and the hired medical team overseeing Ozzy's care. Allegedly, Kelly had clashed with a private nurse weeks before the incident, accusing them of lying and making Dad worse. Neighbors reported loud shouting matches coming from the property during late-night hours. Delivery drivers noted an increase in Amazon orders of medical supplies and gloves. And then came the most damning piece of evidence. DNA analysis of the gloves retrieved from the footage. Though the Osbourne legal team fought to suppress the test results, a leak from inside the lab revealed the gloves contained traces of blood matching Ozzy Osbourne's DNA. That leak was the final nail. Kelly Osbourne was arrested days later. Her mugshot, tired, tear-streaked, defiant, made front-page news worldwide. The charge? Tampering with a death scene. Though prosecutors did not accuse her of causing Ozzy's death directly, they believed she had interfered with evidence, obstructed emergency responders, and possibly delayed medical assistance in his final moments. As the trial date approached, the world held its breath. Was this a grieving daughter who panicked? A cold manipulator hiding a crime? Or something far more tragic? A human being crumbling under pressure in a world that never let her breathe? This video will unpack it all. Over the next several chapters, we'll examine the Osbournes like never before. Not through the lens of celebrity, but through the raw truth of what happens when love, power, fame, and mortality collide. We'll speak with legal analysts who've studied every frame of the footage. We'll explore the psychiatric evaluations of Kelly during the trial. We'll analyze the family's carefully controlled media strategy. And most importantly, we'll ask the question no one has dared to confront. Was this the result of a single night of madness, or a tragedy decades in the making? Before there were surveillance tapes, courtrooms, or speculation of bloodstained gloves, there was a family unlike any other. A family that defined chaos, rock and roll, and reality television. To understand how it all unraveled so dramatically, we must begin where the legend began, with Ozzy Osbourne himself. Born John Michael Osbourne on December 3, 1948, in Birmingham, England, Ozzy was never destined for a conventional life. Raised in a working-class household alongside 5 siblings, Ozzy struggled with undiagnosed learning difficulties and a troubled early education. But from a young age, he was drawn to music and to the idea of defying everything expected of him. In the late 1960s, he found his voice, both literally and metaphorically, as the lead singer of Black Sabbath, a band that would go on to define heavy metal. With its ominous guitar riffs, dark lyrics, and terrifying stage presence, Black Sabbath introduced the world to a new genre of music that spoke directly to the disaffected, the angry, and the outsiders. And at the center of it all was Ozzy, with his wild eyes, unpredictable antics, and a voice that could both soothe and terrify. Yet even as he was becoming a musical icon, Ozzy was also falling deeper into the vortex of drugs, alcohol, and personal instability. By the late 1970s, his bandmates had had enough. He was fired from Black Sabbath in 1979 for substance abuse and unreliability. Most musicians would have faded into oblivion after such a dismissal, but not Ozzy. With the fierce management of his then-girlfriend and future wife, Sharon Arden, Ozzy launched a solo career that would eclipse even his Black Sabbath fame. Albums like Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman became legendary. The bat-biting incident, the dove-biting incident, the arrests, the accusations of Satanism. These stories fueled his myth, but underneath it all was a man barely holding on. Then came Sharon. Sharon Osbourne was unlike anyone Ozzy had ever known. Fiercely intelligent, business-savvy, and utterly unafraid, she took control of his career, his finances, and eventually his life. Their relationship was volatile. There were fights, separations, even allegations of violence, but they always came back together. Sharon wasn't just Ozzy's manager. She was his enabler, his protector, and arguably, the architect of his redemption. Together, they had 3 children, Amy, Kelly, and Jack. While Amy largely stayed out of the spotlight, Kelly and Jack would soon become household names. The Osbourne children grew up in a surreal world, surrounded by nannies, security, and cameras. Their father was a rock god, their mother a fierce matriarch. Their home was filled with dogs, staff, and chaos. And in 2002, that chaos was exported to millions of viewers worldwide. When the Osbournes debuted on MTV, it shattered every expectation of what a reality show could be. Unlike the carefully scripted dramas or polished game shows of the era, the Osbournes was raw, loud, funny, and dysfunctional. It wasn't unusual to see Ozzy wandering around muttering to himself, Sharon screaming about dog poop, Kelly throwing a tantrum over clothes, or Jack sneaking out with friends. It was, in every sense of the word, real. And America couldn't get enough of it. Kelly, at just 17 years old, became an overnight sensation. She was the rebellious punk daughter, the mouthy teenager with streaked hair, attitude, and a wardrobe that screamed individuality. She released a debut album, launched fashion lines, and began making appearances across red carpets and talk shows. But with fame came pressure, and with pressure came cracks. Behind the scenes, Kelly was struggling. Her identity, while rooted in rebellion, was also deeply connected to her family's fame. Without Ozzy, without Sharon, there was no Kelly Osbourne brand. And that weight began to suffocate her. She turned to drugs, Vicodin, then stronger substances. Her stints in rehab became public knowledge. The media, once fascinated by her charisma, now began cataloging her downward spiral with cruel precision. Yet somehow, Kelly always came back swinging. She reinvented herself multiple times. Co-host of Fashion Police, judge on Project Runway, red carpet commentator, podcaster. She lost weight, changed her look, underwent surgeries, and tried to distance herself from the bratty teenager the public remembered. She was growing, maturing, and seeking control over her narrative. And through it all, her bond with her father remained a defining feature of her public persona. Ozzy was no longer the same man he had been in the 1980s. Decades of substance abuse had taken their toll. He was forgetful, physically frail, and prone to bizarre behavior. But in Kelly's eyes, he was still Dad. She spoke often of their connection, of watching old movies together, talking about music, and her desire to protect him from the world. It was a narrative that resonated with fans. The rebellious daughter turned loyal caregiver. The wild child who'd become a guardian. The girl who refused to walk away even when things got hard. But as Ozzy's health continued to decline, cracks began to form once again. Ozzy's public battle with Parkinson's was painful to witness. He was no longer performing. His voice was softer, his gait unsteady. Every photo of him in public showed a man weighed down by years, illness, and exhaustion. And Kelly was often right beside him, pushing his wheelchair, adjusting his mask, shielding him from cameras. But behind closed doors, those who knew the family say the mood was darker. There were rumors of strained finances, lavish spending catching up to a slowing income stream. Reports of disagreements between siblings about care decisions. Tensions between Kelly and the hired staff tasked with managing Ozzy's medical needs. Allegations that Sharon had stepped back from day-to-day caregiving, leaving Kelly to handle the brunt of it. If these claims are true, Kelly may have found herself in a terrifying position, emotionally drained, physically exhausted, and completely alone. Some who visited the house in Ozzy's final months describe a home shrouded in silence. The once loud, chaotic Osbourne household had become eerily quiet. Friends were turned away. Nurses were swapped out. Visitors were limited. Kelly was seen less and less in public. When she did appear, her tone was defensive, her demeanor tense. And then, suddenly, the silence was shattered. The leaked footage didn't just show a woman entering a room. It captured a legacy collapsing. For years, Kelly had tried to be more than a reality TV caricature. She had tried to build a career on her own merit, to redefine herself as a voice of fashion, culture, and maturity. But all of that vanished in an instant when her image flashed across the screen in that surveillance video, walking toward her father's room, gloved, pale, and mechanical. The public didn't see a fashion commentator. They saw a suspect. And in that moment, decades of celebrity mythos crumbled into something far more primal. A daughter and a father, locked in a final chapter neither could control. As we move deeper into this story, we must remember who these people were before the headlines. Before the trial, before the speculation, the Osbournes were a family. Flawed, eccentric, explosive, but a family nonetheless. And like any family, their greatest battles weren't fought on television, but in the quiet moments behind closed doors. While the public image of the Osbourne family was always rooted in extremes, chaos, loudness, unpredictability, few understood the depth of the emotional fractures that ran beneath that turbulent surface. To the outside world, they were eccentric, over the top, and somehow functional within their dysfunction. But within the guarded walls of their sprawling Beverly Hills compound, the cracks had been growing for years, and those closest to the family knew that a storm had been building long before any surveillance footage was leaked. It was easy to forget, amid the constant media cycles and outlandish headlines, that the Osbournes were not just television personalities. They were real people struggling to maintain a sense of normalcy in a world that demanded constant spectacle. And no one bore the burden of that contradiction more than Kelly Osbourne. From a very young age, Kelly's identity was shaped by conflict. On one hand, she was born into immense privilege, her father a global rock icon, her mother a powerful entertainment manager. On the other, she was subjected to extraordinary pressure, placed under the microscope of global media before she even had the tools to understand who she was. Her adolescence played out not in privacy, but in the public arena, where every misstep became a headline. Kelly's volatility was not a secret. Even during the early seasons of the Osbournes, she was known for her fiery temper and emotional outbursts. While fans adored her honesty and sass, those moments hinted at deeper struggles, insecurities, unresolved trauma, and a longing for control in a family that rarely offered it. As she entered adulthood, those traits would evolve into a complex blend of resilience and fragility, independence and codependence. And nowhere was that complexity more visible than in her relationship with her father. Ozzy and Kelly had always shared a bond that defied explanation. They were alike in many ways, artistic, emotional, impulsive. But as Ozzy's health declined, that bond took on a new form. Kelly became not just a daughter but a defender, a voice, and eventually, a caretaker. And in doing so, she began to take on more than anyone could bear. Multiple sources who worked inside the Osbourne estate during this time have spoken of a slow but steady shift in the household dynamic. Where once there were assistants, cooks, housekeepers, and a rotating door of visitors, the home grew quieter, more insulated. Sharon, once a constant force of authority, was reportedly spending more time in London, handling business affairs and media commitments. Jack, who had carved out his own path in production and adventure travel, was said to be focused on his children and largely absent from the day-to-day affairs of the house. That left Kelly. What started as a voluntary role, sitting with her father during chemotherapy, organizing his medication, ensuring his privacy, gradually became a full-time responsibility. And with that responsibility came strain. It wasn't just the physical toll. It was emotional, psychological. Watching a parent, especially one as legendary as Ozzy, lose control of his body, his voice, his mind. The man who once captivated millions on stage now needed help getting out of bed. And while nurses and aides rotated through the estate, Kelly reportedly developed a distrust for many of them. One private nurse, who asked not to be named, recalled a particularly intense altercation with Kelly. "She accused me of lying to her about the medication dosage," the nurse said. "She was convinced I was part of some plan to sedate him. I tried to explain that the doses were doctor-approved, but she didn't want to hear it. She yelled, and I left the job that night." This wasn't an isolated incident. Two separate staffers later claimed that Kelly would micromanage every aspect of her father's care, often overriding medical advice, insisting on specific supplements, changing diets, and even limiting who could enter his room. Whether driven by love, control, or paranoia, her actions created an atmosphere of fear and mistrust. But the strain wasn't just internal. Public pressure continued to mount. Paparazzi stalked the property. Journalists speculated daily about Ozzy's condition. Fans flooded social media demanding updates. And despite Kelly's efforts to shield her father from the worst of it, the pressure seeped in. One source close to the family described Kelly during this time as unraveling in slow motion. She was exhausted. You could see it in her eyes. She was angry all the time, snapping at everyone, accusing people of betrayal. It wasn't the Kelly I knew from years ago. It was like she was on high alert constantly, like she was preparing for something awful to happen. Perhaps she was. The thing about living on the edge, emotionally, physically, psychologically, is that it doesn't take much to push you over. And for Kelly, that push came in the form of isolation. She had effectively cut herself off from most of her support network. Friends were no longer visiting the estate. Business associates had stopped calling. Even family members kept their distance, citing her unpredictable behavior. There was also speculation that Kelly had relapsed during this period, though no official confirmation was ever given. Rumors of empty wine bottles, late-night deliveries, and erratic social media activity painted a portrait of someone teetering on the brink. One insider noted, "It wasn't about addiction anymore. It was about survival." She was trying to hold it all together, but the weight was just too much. Meanwhile, Ozzy's condition continued to deteriorate. In early reports leading up to the incident, doctors noted that Ozzy was suffering from increased cognitive decline. Parkinson's, combined with past trauma and medication side effects, had begun to erode his ability to communicate clearly. Some days, he didn't recognize visitors. Other days, he was lucid and alert, begging for a return to normalcy. These fluctuations were deeply confusing, not just for doctors, but for Kelly as well. Imagine being a daughter who, one moment, sees a spark of your old father come to life, only to watch it vanish hours later. Imagine living in that emotional seesaw every day, unsure whether you're helping or hurting, watching the man who raised you slip further into fragility while the world watches and judges. That was Kelly's reality. It's also important to consider the context of the Osbourne legacy, where strength was often mistaken for invincibility, and where vulnerability was treated as weakness. Kelly had grown up in a house where emotions were loud, dramatic, but rarely discussed in meaningful ways. There was no roadmap for navigating this kind of grief, the slow, agonizing loss of a loved one who's still alive but fading before your eyes. And so, like many trapped in a cycle of trauma and caretaking, Kelly began to retreat into herself. The few remaining friends who did check in said their calls were rarely returned. Her social media, once filled with promotional posts and witty banter, fell silent. When she did reappear online, her captions were cryptic. One in particular stood out. "I don't know who I am without him." It was posted just 3 weeks before the surveillance footage would surface. And yet, even as the walls were closing in, there were still moments, fleeting but meaningful, that hinted at a daughter still clinging to love. Quiet photos of her holding Ozzy's hand. A birthday post with a childhood photo and a simple caption, "Always your little girl." Interviews from years prior where she talked about her father being her hero. These glimpses serve as painful reminders that tragedy rarely arrives out of nowhere. It builds. It festers. It grows in the dark places between love and obligation, between devotion and resentment. And when it finally erupts, the world sees only the explosion, not the long, slow burn that caused it. What happened inside the Osbourne home was not the result of a single bad day. It was the result of years, decades, of pressure, secrets, emotional burden, and public scrutiny. It was the inevitable conclusion of a family that had lived its life in the spotlight, only to discover that the shadows they had been hiding from were growing larger by the day. In the final stretch of his life, Ozzy Osbourne no longer resembled the unkillable rock icon the world had come to know. He was no longer the bat-biting wild man of heavy metal or the stumbling, endearing father fans adored on television. He had become a pale, skeletal version of his former self, body hunched, voice barely audible, and memories flickering in and out like faulty stage lights. It was the heartbreaking unraveling of a living legend, and for those inside the Osbourne compound, watching it unfold was both unbearable and deeply confusing. Ozzy's health struggles had been mounting for years, but it wasn't until 2019 that things began to publicly spiral. Following a severe fall in his home that dislodged metal rods from a previous accident, Ozzy underwent multiple surgeries. These weren't simple procedures. They were invasive, long, and physically devastating. While recovering, he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, a progressive neurological disorder that would explain his shaking hands, slurred speech, and stiff movements. That diagnosis alone would have been overwhelming for anyone. But for Ozzy, it came on top of decades of physical damage, spinal injuries, vocal cord trauma, respiratory issues, not to mention the toll of substance abuse. His body was a battlefield, scarred by rock and roll, surgeries, and time. And in the quiet corners of the Osbourne mansion, the man who once commanded stadiums with guttural howls now struggled to walk across a room. By 2021, those close to the family began to notice a pattern. Ozzy's public appearances were becoming rare. He missed several award shows, canceled press events, and remained largely out of sight. When he did appear, usually photographed in a wheelchair or leaning heavily on a cane, his eyes appeared glassy and distant. His speech had slowed. He would forget dates, names, and sometimes even where he was. According to insiders, Ozzy's days became increasingly structured around medication schedules and short, supervised walks around the estate. A team of medical professionals, neurologists, physiotherapists, and private nurses rotated shifts. But even with the best care money could buy, Parkinson's marched on. The once vibrant walls of the Osbourne mansion, once filled with laughter, filming crews, and loud music, fell quiet. Ozzy rarely left his room, preferring dim lighting and silence. A large recliner was positioned near the window where he'd sit for hours, barely speaking, watching the sky change. At night, his insomnia returned. He'd sometimes call out to Sharon or Kelly without realizing they weren't in the room. For Kelly, these changes were gutting. This was her father, the man who once pulled her on stage, who sang lullabies in a growl, who cried when she went to rehab the first time. She wasn't just witnessing his physical decline. She was watching him slip away mentally, piece by piece. And that slow erasure created a tension in her heart, a desperate need to preserve what was left, and a growing fury at the world that had allowed this to happen. Sharon, ever the businesswoman, focused her energy on protecting Ozzy's legacy. She curated press releases, controlled social media narratives, and ensured that every public statement downplayed his deterioration. But behind the scenes, she too was unraveling. Multiple sources claimed that she had emotional breakdowns during meetings, that she was increasingly absent from the home, and that her relationship with Kelly grew strained as the months went on. The family was fragmenting under the weight of inevitability. It wasn't just Parkinson's. In late 2022, Ozzy underwent yet another major surgery, this time to realign his spine, which had shifted due to his previous injuries. Doctors warned the family that recovery would be brutal. The pain was immense. Physical therapy became a daily struggle. There were days he refused to eat, nights when he cried from agony. And during one particularly difficult week, Ozzy reportedly told Kelly, "I'm tired, love. So bloody tired." Those words haunted her. In the final months before the incident, the Osbourne estate became more of a care facility than a home. Nurses were on 24-hour shifts. Cameras were installed in every hallway. Meals were delivered, but rarely eaten. Friends were no longer welcome without permission. A sense of dread had overtaken the house, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the moment when Ozzy would stop breathing. One of the most controversial decisions during this time was the installation of internal surveillance cameras. Sharon and the legal team justified the cameras as a safety measure. With Ozzy's frequent falls and confusion, having visual confirmation of his movements was necessary for both his protection and liability. But others, including some family members, found the decision invasive. It made the house feel less like a sanctuary and more like a monitored institution. Every hallway, every entrance, every common space was under surveillance. Most notably, the hallway leading to Ozzy's bedroom. That footage would later become the centerpiece of the investigation. But before we get there, we must revisit the days immediately preceding the incident. Several odd occurrences were reported by staff in the week prior. One nurse claimed that Ozzy had become agitated and refused his medication for 2 days, accusing staff of trying to poison him. A private chef was let go after Kelly allegedly accused them of preparing food that made her father delirious. And perhaps most chillingly, a gardener reported hearing shouting from Ozzy's window one night. A female voice pleading, crying, and a loud thud. That thud would echo later in the courtroom. While no official incident report was filed that week, those close to the household knew that something was unraveling. Kelly was seen pacing in the backyard late at night, talking to herself, crying. Security staff noted that she was sleeping irregularly, sometimes staying awake for 2 or 3 days straight. She had become obsessed with organizing medical files, collecting old photos of Ozzy, and repeatedly demanding changes to his treatment plan. At one point, she reportedly told a nurse, "He's slipping away, and no one is doing anything." That helplessness, combined with grief, isolation, and pressure, created a dangerous cocktail of emotions. Kelly was not just exhausted. She was fraying. Then came the day. The morning of the incident began like any other, quiet. The sun rose over the estate. Staff made their rounds. Ozzy was unresponsive during breakfast, which wasn't unusual. Kelly was seen entering his room around 10 a.m. and staying there for nearly an hour. According to logs, she requested that no one disturb them. When she left, she reportedly looked pale, silent, and dazed. Security staff noted that she walked past them without saying a word, went to her room, and closed the door. Ozzy was found unresponsive shortly after noon. Paramedics were called, but resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, brought on by a combination of Parkinson's-related complications and stress on the body due to recent surgeries. But even as the death certificate was signed, questions lingered. Why had Kelly been the last person to see him alive? Why had she been wearing gloves? And why did the surveillance footage show her discarding those gloves in a black bag? The hours following Ozzy's death were surreal. The estate was flooded with investigators. Sharon returned immediately from London. Jack arrived later that day. Statements were taken, footage reviewed. And though the family appeared united in grief publicly, behind closed doors, suspicions were growing. Kelly refused to speak to investigators at first. She stayed in her room, refused meals, wouldn't respond to messages. When she finally emerged, she claimed that she had simply been cleaning up after her father, a common task she'd done dozens of times. The gloves, she said, were used to help him dress and apply ointment to a pressure sore. The blood, she insisted, must have come from a nosebleed or small wound. But investigators weren't convinced, especially not after the gloves were recovered and analyzed. The presence of Ozzy's blood was confirmed, but it wasn't just on the fingertips. It was on the inside of the gloves, on the palms, and in the lining. This suggested not passive contact, but something more involved, something more deliberate. As the forensics reports were compiled, as staff were re-interviewed, and as Sharon and Jack began to distance themselves from Kelly in subtle ways, the foundation of the family's unity cracked completely. What had begun as a long, painful decline in Ozzy's health had ended with a mystery soaked in grief, guilt, and suspicion. And at the center of it all was a daughter who had tried to be everything to everyone, and who, in the end, may have lost herself completely. When the first frame of the surveillance footage appeared online, the world stopped. The video wasn't high resolution. It didn't have audio. There were no dramatic camera angles, no cinematic pans. It was raw, cold, and simple, black and white frames taken from a fixed security camera placed in the corridor outside Ozzy Osbourne's private bedroom. And yet, what it lacked in polish, it made up for in raw, haunting implication. The video file was leaked anonymously, first surfacing on an obscure celebrity gossip forum. The original post was titled simply, Osbourne Estate, March 15th footage, you need to see this. It contained one attachment, an 18-minute video clip, timestamped from 2:47 a.m. to just after 3:05 a.m., recorded on the night of Ozzy Osbourne's death. Initially dismissed as a possible deepfake or hoax, the video gained traction when a second source, allegedly a former security staffer, confirmed its authenticity. They claimed the footage came from the estate's internal surveillance system, which had been installed several months prior as part of a broader security overhaul initiated by Sharon Osbourne. The cameras were meant to protect Ozzy and monitor staff activities, not to implicate a member of the family in a chilling mystery. But that's exactly what happened. The footage begins uneventfully. The corridor is dimly lit, with soft shadows cast along the walls. At 2:47 a.m., nothing moves. For nearly 8 minutes, the only activity captured is a subtle flickering of the hallway lights and a faint rustle of movement far down the corridor, perhaps a staff member changing shifts or checking on something off camera. Then, at 2:55 a.m., Kelly Osbourne enters the frame. She's wearing what appears to be a black hoodie, gray sweatpants, and slippers. Her hair is tied back in a loose bun. She walks slowly but deliberately, not pausing to look at the camera. In her left hand, she's carrying a small black bag. Her right hand is gloved. Moments later, she pulls a matching glove from the bag and puts it on her left hand. The movement is precise, practiced, almost clinical. She stands outside Ozzy's door for 5 seconds, still unmoving. Then she opens it and enters. The door remains ajar. This is where the footage becomes particularly difficult to interpret. Because of the angle, we can't see what's happening inside the room. We can only see the edge of the door frame, a sliver of carpet, and the glow of a small lamp inside. What follows is a 6-minute stretch in which the audience sees nothing but a flickering light, the occasional shadowy movement, and the eerie stillness of a house asleep. Then, at 3:03 a.m., Kelly reappears. She backs out of the room slowly, still wearing the gloves. Her hoodie sleeves are now pushed up slightly, and she seems to be breathing heavily, though there's no audio to confirm. She turns away from the camera, reaches into her bag, and pulls out a Ziploc pouch. With measured hands, she removes the gloves, one finger at a time, and drops them into the pouch. She seals it, presses it flat, and slides it back into the bag. The most chilling moment comes at the 3:05 mark. As she turns back toward the camera and begins walking down the hallway, one of the overhead lights flickers, illuminating her hands for just a fraction of a second. It's enough to reveal a glistening residue on her forearms, faint but visible. A reddish-brown smudge near her wrist. A stain on the edge of her hoodie cuff. When enhanced by analysts, these frames appear to show what investigators would later describe as a high-probability presence of blood. That 1 second of light, that one frozen frame, became the focal point of an international investigation. But to truly understand the gravity of what the footage showed, one must look at more than just the visuals. It was the context, the timing, the behavior, the choices that made the video so disturbing. According to the estate's routine logs, Ozzy's last confirmed contact with a nurse was at 10:45 p.m. the night before. He had taken his medication, eaten half of a meal prepared by staff, and requested solitude. Nothing unusual was reported. The internal system noted that Kelly checked in on him at 11:15 p.m., but that visit was brief, less than 10 minutes. There was no reason for her to return at 3 a.m. Except she did. Security staff confirmed they were unaware of Kelly's midnight visit until the footage leaked. The night guard on duty had taken a break during the precise window of her appearance and failed to notice the hallway monitor. When asked about Kelly's movements that night, he initially said, "I assumed she was just heading to the kitchen or checking on her dad like usual." But the gloves? The bag? The sealed pouch? None of that seemed usual. The estate's medical team was also alarmed. Dr. Miriam Castillo, one of Ozzy's attending physicians, told investigators she had warned the family not to apply ointments or medications without her direction. Kelly, she claimed, had developed a habit of Googling treatments, challenging prescriptions, and at times acting without consultation. She meant well, but she was often misinformed and emotional, Dr. Castillo said. That combination can be dangerous. So what was Kelly doing in that room? According to her initial statement, given weeks later, She claimed she entered the room to check on her father after waking from a nightmare. "I had a feeling something was wrong," she said. "I went to him, found he had bled from a sore on his back. I cleaned it up, made sure he was stable, and left." When asked about the gloves, she said she always wore them when applying medical cream. The bag, she claimed, was used to collect used gauze and dispose of them properly. But forensic specialists weren't convinced. The amount of blood suggested by the residue on the gloves exceeded what would be expected from a minor's sore. The glove material also showed compression marks, tight, uneven creases that suggested forceful handling. And though Kelly insisted she left the gloves in her room, their sudden reappearance in the hands of investigators raised further suspicion. According to leaked documents, the gloves were discovered not in her room, but inside a small bathroom cabinet, wrapped in a towel and placed behind cleaning supplies. A location far removed from any medical waste bin. What was she hiding? Prosecutors would later argue that this act, removing the gloves, sealing them, and hiding them, suggested a consciousness of guilt. It wasn't just caregiving. It was concealment. But the video didn't just raise questions about guilt or innocence. It raised something more unsettling, a sense that something deeply broken had occurred inside that house. The footage didn't show violence. It didn't show an attack, but it did show a moment of profound isolation. A daughter entering a room, performing some private ritual, and emerging with blood on her hands. There were no screams, no alarms, no emergency calls, just silence. The footage also captured the eerie calm that followed. After Kelly walked down the hallway and disappeared from view, the camera continued to roll. For another 2 minutes, nothing moved. Then, the hallway lights dimmed, the flickering stopped, and the estate returned to its stillness. The calm before the storm. When the video hit the public domain, reactions were immediate. News outlets ran it on loop. Legal analysts debated the implications. Fans of the Osbournes were divided. Some saw a grieving daughter trying to help a dying father. Others saw something darker, a woman who had crossed a line and tried to cover her tracks. Online communities exploded with theories. Frame-by-frame breakdowns, color enhancements, voiceover speculation. People analyzed Kelly's body language, her breathing, her hand movements. One theory suggested she had attempted to revive her father and panicked when it failed. Another posited that she had discovered his body already cold and, fearing public blame, attempted to remove any trace of her presence. And yet, through all the speculation, one truth remained. No one knew exactly what happened in that room. Not the viewers, not the investigators, perhaps not even Kelly herself. Because trauma does strange things to the human mind. It warps memory. It distorts reality. And when combined with grief, guilt, and years of emotional baggage, it can push a person to actions they never imagined. The surveillance footage didn't offer resolution. It offered questions. It peeled back a layer of secrecy, exposing not just a single event, but an entire atmosphere of tension, confusion, and emotional fragility. It showed the edge of something. And whatever that something was, it would go on to define the criminal investigation, the trial, and the public reckoning that followed. In the days and weeks following the release of the now infamous surveillance video, the entire narrative surrounding Ozzy Osbourne's final moments pivoted into a full-blown forensic mystery. The footage had ignited a firestorm of public curiosity, but it also set into motion a far more serious response. A detailed, painstaking analysis by some of the nation's top forensic experts. This wasn't just about gossip anymore. This was now about evidence, potentially criminal evidence, being evaluated not just by fans on social media, but by prosecutors, digital imaging professionals, blood pattern analysts, and psychological experts tasked with interpreting behavior, posture, and possible intent. The first step in the process was authenticating the video. Though its origins were shrouded in secrecy, law enforcement quickly confirmed that the file had been copied from the Osbourne estate's internal camera system. The digital watermark on the lower corner of the footage matched that of the security software used in the home. Timestamps aligned with electronic keycard entries. Even the positioning of hallway furniture, artwork, rugs, and sconces matched archived photos of the property, leaving no doubt about its legitimacy. Once authenticated, digital forensic analysts enhanced the video using state-of-the-art image correction software. These enhancements included stabilization of shaky frames, color augmentation to better observe potential staining, and motion magnification to study slight movements of the subject. What they uncovered raised even more questions. Dr. Felix Romano, a digital forensics expert who had testified in multiple high-profile trials, was among the first brought in by the district attorney's office. His analysis of the footage zeroed in on several key moments. At timestamp 2 hours 56 minutes and 12 seconds, when Kelly puts on the second glove, there is a visible dark smudge on the cuff of her hoodie, just beneath the wrist. Dr. Romano's team isolated that frame and ran it through spectral analysis. The results were consistent with fresh biological matter, most likely blood, based on the way light reflected off the stain. At 3 hours 3 minutes and 48 seconds, when Kelly exits Ozzy's room, her left forearm shows smearing consistent with someone having come into contact with a moist or semi-dried surface. It was not splatter. It was not a small dot. It was a drag, a wipe. The suggestion being that Kelly had wiped her hands, or something else, onto her clothing. Most damning, however, were the gloves. Though Kelly initially denied discarding them, a second, hidden camera, located above a laundry cabinet in the back corridor, captured her placing something wrapped in tissue into a utility bin just 40 minutes after she left Ozzy's room. That item was retrieved days later and submitted to the state crime lab for analysis. The gloves tested positive for Ozzy Osbourne's blood, but it wasn't just trace evidence. The gloves contained significant blood concentration, both on the exterior and, intriguingly, the interior. Investigators believe that this could suggest she had come into contact with Ozzy's wounds with bare hands before putting on the gloves, or that the gloves had been worn during an active bleeding episode and improperly removed. Dr. Angela Nguyen, a blood pattern expert with over 25 years of experience, was asked to review the staining found on the gloves and Kelly's hoodie. Her findings were unsettling. The gloves do not show signs of passive blood transfer, such as would occur by touching a dried wound or scab, she said in her official report. Instead, we see directional flow and pressure point stains. This indicates that blood was actively flowing or had recently flowed when contact was made. There are also compression smears, indicating that the gloves made firm, intentional contact with a surface, most likely skin or fabric saturated with blood. When investigators asked Dr. Nguyen what could explain this pattern, her response was blunt. It's either medical intervention during active bleeding or something more aggressive. Naturally, Kelly's legal team pushed back hard. They brought in their own forensics consultants who claimed the blood patterns could have come from a pressure sore or reopened surgical wound on Ozzy's back. These are common among immobile patients, they argued, and sometimes bleed heavily when disturbed. Kelly, they insisted, had tried to treat the wound after discovering it, panicked when she saw the amount of blood, and disposed of the gloves in fear that it would be misunderstood. But prosecutors countered that if the blood came from a known medical issue, why hide the gloves? Why place them in a bin behind cleaning supplies? Why not alert the night staff or call a nurse immediately? It was these behavioral inconsistencies that brought psychologists into the fold. Dr. Lee Stratton, a criminal behavioral expert and clinical psychologist, reviewed hours of footage of Kelly before and after the incident. She described her behavior that night as detached, emotionally dysregulated, and potentially dissociative. She doesn't appear frantic, which we might expect if she had stumbled upon her father in medical distress, Stratton noted. Instead, she's slow, methodical, and oddly focused on the act of concealment. Her analysis also pointed to a pattern of suppressed emotion, something she suggested may stem from years of unresolved trauma, compounded by the high-stakes pressure of being a caregiver in an unstable environment. The defense, meanwhile, pushed a very different interpretation. They argued that Kelly's behavior was not dissociative but exhausted. She had been awake for days, they claimed. She was grieving, scared, and overwhelmed by guilt. Her decision to hide the gloves, they said, was rooted not in criminality, but in panic. People don't always behave rationally in moments of trauma, Kelly's attorney stated during early hearings. Especially people who've been under constant pressure, dealing with a loved one's slow death, living inside a fortress of cameras and expectations. Still, there was another piece of evidence experts couldn't ignore. Kelly's timeline didn't align. According to the medical logs and hallway security badges, no one else entered or exited Ozzy's room between 11 p.m. and the time paramedics were called. That meant Kelly was the last person to see him alive and the first to discover him unresponsive. Her initial claim was that she entered the room at 3 a.m., saw him asleep, cleaned a small wound, and left. But when asked why she didn't return to check again, or why she didn't notice he had died, she gave conflicting answers. "I thought he was just asleep," she said in one statement. "I knew something was wrong, but I didn't want to believe it," she said in another. To the jury of public opinion, this inconsistency was damning. To prosecutors, it was motive. They didn't accuse Kelly of murder. The official charge was evidence tampering and obstruction of medical assistance. But to build their case, they leaned heavily on the footage and the expert interpretations surrounding it. Still, the footage wasn't all cold science and timestamps. There was a human element, raw and painful, that echoed through every frame. Analysts studying the footage couldn't help but remark on the haunting loneliness of it all. A dim corridor, a woman in slippers and gloves, a legendary voice forever silenced just a few feet away. This wasn't just about a daughter accused of mishandling a death. It was about grief so heavy it distorts reality, about years of unresolved pain compacting into one irreversible moment. There were no clear answers, only possibilities. In the end, the footage became a symbol, not of certainty, but of ambiguity. It told a story without narration. It invited speculation without offering resolution. And while experts could dissect patterns and behavior, they could never quite explain the emotions that spilled across those black and white frames. Because sometimes, the truth isn't captured in 18 minutes of silent video. Sometimes, it's hidden in the years that led up to it, in the tension, the trauma, the love, and the unspoken agony of watching someone you adore slip away piece by piece. The surveillance footage had barely been circulating for 24 hours before the investigation into Kelly Osbourne officially began. What started as a private tragedy within one of the most iconic families in the music world was rapidly becoming a full-scale legal inquiry, spurred on by the disturbing implications of the leaked video. It wasn't just about what the footage showed. It was about what it suggested. Something was wrong, very wrong, and the authorities needed to know exactly what that was. Law enforcement agencies, beginning with the Beverly Hills Police Department, immediately launched a preliminary inquiry after the footage's authenticity was confirmed. They secured a warrant to collect digital evidence from the Osbourne estate's security system, requesting all recordings from the 48 hours before and after the timestamp on the leaked clip. In addition, forensic teams were dispatched to sweep the estate for any remaining physical evidence, namely, the gloves that had become the center of the swirling mystery. Within 3 days, officers recovered the gloves wrapped in a towel beneath a locked cabinet inside one of the lesser-used guest bathrooms on the east wing of the Osbourne estate. DNA analysis, as already reported, matched the blood on the gloves to Ozzy Osbourne. But what investigators found even more troubling was the amount of time that had passed between Kelly's last visit to her father's room and the 911 call that reported him unresponsive. According to digital records pulled from the estate's smart home system, Kelly exited Ozzy's room at approximately 3:03 a.m. The emergency call wasn't made until 6:41 a.m., over 3.5 hours later. This gap sent investigators into a frenzy. What had happened in that missing time? And why hadn't anyone else in the household known that Ozzy had passed? The estate, which had employed multiple staffers including private nurses and 2 overnight security officers, seemed eerily silent during that window. The housekeeper who discovered Ozzy's unresponsive body later told authorities she assumed he had simply overslept. It was only when she went in to bring him breakfast that she realized something was off. But by that point, critical hours had been lost. As this information came to light, the focus of the investigation shifted from simply understanding how Ozzy died to determining whether anyone in the home had contributed to his death or actively attempted to conceal the circumstances around it. Kelly was officially identified as a person of interest within 5 days of the footage being verified. Detectives initially reached out to her informally, requesting a voluntary interview. She declined. Her attorney released a statement shortly after, insisting that Kelly was grieving deeply and not in a mental state to endure public questioning at this time. They added that she would cooperate fully when she was ready, and that the family asks for privacy as they process their devastating loss. Privately, however, things were unraveling. Sources close to the case revealed that Sharon Osbourne, who had initially defended her daughter publicly, had become increasingly quiet in internal family meetings. There were whispers that she was shocked by the footage, disturbed by Kelly's behavior, and uncertain about how to proceed. Jack, ever the pragmatist, reportedly told investigators that while he believed Kelly meant no harm, she wasn't herself in the final weeks of Ozzy's life. Meanwhile, detectives began interviewing staff, gathering witness statements, and piecing together a clearer timeline of events. One of the most pivotal interviews came from a night nurse named Larissa Perez, who had worked for the Osbournes on and off for nearly a year. She claimed she was dismissed by Kelly just 2 days before the incident. The reason? A disagreement about medication dosage and nighttime monitoring. I told her that Ozzy needed more oversight at night, Perez said in her sworn statement. His vitals were fluctuating. He was confused. But Kelly insisted that she could handle it. She said, "I've been doing this longer than you have." Perez described Kelly as emotionally charged, easily agitated, and clearly under pressure. Another staff member, a longtime gardener named Marcus Doyle, described seeing Kelly pacing outside in the backyard on the night of the incident, talking to herself and appearing extremely distressed. She was muttering about her dad, how nobody gets it, and they're just waiting for him to die. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, it was strange. The police also examined Kelly's digital footprint during that 72-hour period. Phone records, text messages, and internet search history all became part of the investigation. What they found was not necessarily criminal, but undeniably troubling. Between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. the night of the incident, Kelly's phone showed repeated searches for terms such as how to help someone dying from Parkinson's, signs of internal bleeding, and what to do when a parent stops breathing. She also sent a series of texts to an unidentified contact saved only as J, which read, "He's fading faster than anyone realizes. I can't do this alone anymore. Is it wrong to want this to be over?" Those texts, prosecutors would later argue, pointed to a psychological state on the edge, someone who may have acted out of desperation rather than intent, but whose actions still carried legal consequences. 6 days after the video surfaced, Kelly Osbourne was officially called in for a formal interview under subpoena. She appeared at the Beverly Hills precinct flanked by 2 attorneys, wearing all black, sunglasses, and a blank expression. The interview lasted nearly 3 hours. She refused to answer several direct questions on the advice of counsel, including whether she had physically touched her father's body after entering the room and whether she had attempted to clean any evidence from the scene. What she did admit, however, was that she was the last person to see him alive, and that she had panicked upon discovering that he was no longer breathing. "I froze," she reportedly told investigators. "I didn't want it to be true. I sat next to him for a long time. I just kept thinking he'd open his eyes, that he wasn't gone." This admission contradicted her earlier public statement in which she claimed she left him resting peacefully and did not notice anything out of the ordinary. The inconsistency became the basis for probable cause. On the 7th day of the investigation, Kelly was officially charged with obstruction of medical assistance and tampering with evidence related to the death of a vulnerable adult. She was taken into custody without incident and released on $250,000 bail the same day. Her mugshot was plastered across every major news outlet within hours. Her expression, stone-faced, tear-stained, and pale, sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry. The fall from grace was complete. The once outspoken, unapologetic, fashion-forward daughter of rock royalty was now at the center of one of the most disturbing cases in celebrity history. But the legal machinery was just getting started. The district attorney's office, led by prosecutor Dana Valenzuela, prepared a 48-page case file based largely on the surveillance footage, forensic reports, and inconsistencies in Kelly's statements. Valenzuela, known for her work in elder abuse cases, held a press conference where she stated, "This case is not about blame. It's about responsibility. It's about the choices we make when someone is vulnerable and in our care. While we do not believe Ms. Osbourne acted with intent to harm, her actions in the aftermath of her father's death violated legal standards designed to protect the elderly and medically fragile." The defense, naturally fought back. Kelly's attorneys argued that the case was being driven by media frenzy, not evidence. They described her as a grieving daughter vilified for being overwhelmed and human. They claimed the glove incident had been misinterpreted, that she had suffered a dissociative episode upon discovering her father's body, and that the prosecution was weaponizing grief. Behind the scenes, the family dynamic was imploding. Before the leak, before the arrest, before the forensic dissection of her every movement, Kelly had maintained a steady online presence. Though less active in recent years, her Instagram account featured a combination of promotional content, charity advocacy, family photos, and the occasional burst of self-deprecating humor. She was known to clap back at trolls with wit and sarcasm, to promote body positivity, and to post loving tributes to her father. But once the investigation launched in full, her feed froze. There were no new posts, no stories, no likes, no comments. It was as though the screen went dark. The last image she had shared, weeks before the video surfaced, was a grainy black and white photograph of her and Ozzy from decades ago. Young Kelly, maybe 8 or 9, was sitting on her dad's lap, beaming. Ozzy was laughing, his signature round glasses pushed up to his forehead. The caption was simple, "Always your little girl." That post became an eerie centerpiece for fans and followers in the days after her arrest. Thousands flooded the comment section with everything from prayers and encouragement to rage and disbelief. Some users expressed heartbreak at what Kelly was going through. Others demanded answers. A few accused her directly of harming Ozzy. The divide between sympathy and suspicion widened quickly. And through it all, she said nothing. No denials. No apologies. No defense. The silence became deafening. According to insiders, Kelly had retreated entirely from the public eye and was staying in a private residence outside Los Angeles, reportedly a property owned by a longtime family friend. Only a handful of people were allowed access. Her phones were monitored. Her therapy sessions increased in frequency. One source close to her legal team described her as catatonic during certain periods, often refusing to get out of bed or respond to messages. "She's grieving," the source said. "She's not just mourning her father. She's mourning herself, the version of her that she thought she was becoming. Everything's gone now." The emotional toll was visible. Paparazzi photos taken during the rare instances she was spotted outside showed a woman almost unrecognizable from the polished TV personality fans remembered. Dressed in oversized clothes, her hair unkempt, her face swollen and tear-streaked, Kelly looked like a person struggling under the weight of immense emotional collapse. She often kept her head down, her face shielded behind large sunglasses and hooded sweatshirts. It was a stark contrast to the woman who had once strutted on red carpets with confidence, critiqued celebrity fashion with authority, and used her platform to advocate for mental health and addiction recovery. Now, it seemed, those very demons she had fought so publicly were clawing their way back to the surface. And the media was relentless. Entertainment news segments ran nightly updates on the case, many using old footage of Kelly's most volatile moments on the Osbournes or clips from interviews where she spoke about her past struggles with substance abuse and anger issues. The framing was clear. The fiery daughter of a rock god had finally imploded. But was it fair? Psychologists and public commentators began weighing in, debating whether Kelly was being vilified for actions that were more tragic than malicious. Some argued that society often places impossible burdens on celebrity children, especially those born into legacy families with global fame. Kelly had never chosen to be famous. It was something she inherited. Others, however, maintained that fame did not excuse concealment of evidence or delay in seeking emergency medical assistance. "She's not on trial for being a grieving daughter," one legal analyst stated on live television. "She's being investigated for what she did in the crucial moments after Ozzy Osbourne died. Those decisions matter, no matter how famous you are." Yet behind the closed doors of her emotional collapse, a more nuanced picture began to form. Friends who had known Kelly for years began speaking out anonymously, painting a portrait of a woman who had been slowly unraveling for some time. One former colleague from her fashion police days described noticing a change in her energy in the months leading up to Ozzy's death. She was quieter, less playful. She seemed consumed with worry. Every time we caught up, she talked about her dad, his pain, his memory lapses, the guilt she felt when she had to leave him even for a few hours. Another former assistant claimed Kelly often cried during car rides, sometimes begging the driver to take the long way home so she could have time to gather herself before walking back into the house. "I don't think people understand how much she carried," the assistant said. "She wasn't just taking care of a sick parent. She was watching her hero disappear. That kind of emotional torture eats you alive." The line between caregiver and codependent had long since blurred. Kelly had, by most accounts, lost herself in her father's decline. And when that decline reached its final, irreversible stage, her own collapse followed immediately after. But the silence on social media and in public was not merely about grief, it was strategic. Kelly's legal team had reportedly instructed her to avoid any public comments about the case, fearing that even the most innocent statement could be used against her in court. One misinterpreted caption, one emotionally charged video, one off-the-cuff remark. Any of it could tilt the perception of a jury or give the prosecution additional ammunition. So she said nothing. But others spoke on her behalf, sometimes without her permission. A controversial interview aired on a late-night talk show featuring a former friend of Kelly's, who claimed they had spoken just days before Ozzy's death. According to the friend, Kelly had said something haunting. "I don't know if I'm helping him or just making it worse." The quote went viral. Headlines twisted it into confessions, theories, and accusations. Even though the friend later walked back the intensity of the statement, saying it was made in a moment of emotional exhaustion, the damage had already been done. In response, Kelly's legal team issued a rare public rebuttal. "Ms. Osbourne is currently under tremendous emotional strain and has not authorized anyone to speak on her behalf," the statement read. "She is mourning the loss of her beloved father and is cooperating fully with the legal process." Still, the narrative in the public domain had spiraled into something far more complicated than a daughter grieving her father. Conspiracy theories gained momentum. Online forums speculated about family feuds, inheritance disputes, and decades of emotional manipulation within the Osbourne household. And through it all, Kelly remained silent. Some believed it was guilt. Others believed it was trauma. A few believed she was being silenced, either by legal counsel or by members of her own family, desperate to salvage what was left of the Osbourne name. But the truth was far less cinematic and far more human. Kelly Osbourne, the girl who once screamed into cameras, who stormed through reality TV sets with all the rage of youth, was now simply trying to survive. And in her own way, her silence was a form of protest. Against the world. Against the spectacle. Against the narrative she no longer controlled. It was also a cry for help. According to those closest to her, Kelly's therapy sessions became increasingly intense. She was said to have experienced recurring panic attacks, nightmares, and severe bouts of depression. On one occasion, a close friend reportedly found her curled up in a bathroom, unresponsive, whispering her father's name over and over again. She didn't want pity. She didn't want redemption. She just wanted it all to stop. But the world wasn't going to stop watching. Not yet. Not while a trial loomed. Not while questions remained unanswered. Not while the footage continued to circulate, analyzed and debated with every passing hour. Kelly's silence may have protected her legally, but emotionally, it came at a steep cost.